What I shall say about public will, which is only another phase of the democratic mind, might well have been introduced under Part 3, but I put it here because, in a sense, it rounds off our whole inquiry, involving some general conclusions as to the method and possibility of social betterment. By public will, we may understand the deliberate self-direction of any social group. There is, of course, nothing mysterious about it, for it is of the same nature as public opinion, and is simply that so informed and organized as to be an effective guide to the life of the group. Nor can we say just when this state is reached, it is a matter of degree, but we may assume that when a group intelligently pursues a steadfast policy, some measure at least of public will has been achieved. Many savage tribes have it in a small way. The Jews developed it under the leadership of Moses and Joshua. The medieval church and the Venetian aristocracy displayed it. It is capable, like individual will, of indefinite improvement in insight, stability, and scope. Just as public and private opinion are general and particular phases of the same thing, so will is a single complex activity with individual and collective aspects. But there is this difference between public and private will, just as there is between other individual and collective phases of mind, that the activity usually appears less conscious when looked at in its larger aspect than when considered in detail. I mean that we generally know a great deal better what we are about as individuals than we do as members of large wholes. When one sits down to dinner, he is conscious of hunger and has a will to appease it. But if his action has any bearing upon the community, as no doubt it has, he is unaware of the fact. In the same way, the activities of business have much consciousness and purpose when looked at in detail, but little when taken collectively. 1,000 men buy and sell in the market, each with a very definite intention regarding his own transaction, but the market price which results from their bargaining is an almost mechanical outcome, not a matter of conscious intention at all. On the other hand, there are conscious wholes in which the general result may be as clearly purposed as the particular, as when an intelligent crew is working a vessel, each attending to his own work, but understanding perfectly what the general purpose is and how he is contributing to it. So, if we restrict the word will to that which shows reflective consciousness and purpose, there is a sense in which a certain choice, as of the purchaser in the market, may express individual will but not public will. There is a public side to it, of course, but of an involuntary sort. We must remember also that although large wholes are, as a rule, much inferior to individuals in explicit consciousness and purpose, they are capable of rational structure and action of a somewhat mechanical sort, far transcending that of the individual mind. This is because of the vast scope and indefinite duration they may have, which enables them to store up and systematize the work of innumerable persons, as a nation does, or even an industrial corporation. A large whole may and usually does display in its activity a kind of rationality or adaptation of means to ends, which, as a whole, was never planned or purposed by anybody, but is the involuntary result of innumerable special endeavors. Thus, the British colonial empire, which looks like the result of deliberate and far-sighted policy, is conceded to have been, for the most part, the unforeseen outcome of personal enterprise. An institution, as we have seen in previous chapters, is not fully human, but may nevertheless be superhuman, in the sense that it may express a wisdom beyond the grasp of any one man. And even in a moral aspect, it is by no means safe to assume that the personal is superior to the collective. This may or may not be the case, depending, among other things, upon whether there has been a past growth of collective moral judgment upon the point in question. The civil law, for example, which is the result of such a growth, is for the most part a much safer guide regarding property rights than the untrained judgment of any individual. But after all, public thought and will have the same superiority over unconscious adaptation, wonderful as the results of that often are, as private thought and will have over mere instinct and habit. They represent a higher principle of coordination and adaptation, one which, properly employed, saves energy and prevents mistakes. The British may have succeeded on instinct, but probably they would have succeeded better if more reason had been mixed with it. And the latter may save them from the decay which has attacked other great empires. It is quite plain that the social development of the past has been mostly blind and without human intention. Any page of history will show that men have been unable to foresee, much less to control, the larger movements of life. There have been seers, but they have had only flashes of light and have almost never been men of immediate sway. Even great statesmen have lived in the present, feeling their way, and having commonly no purpose beyond the aggrandizement of their country or their order. Such partial exceptions as the framing of the American Constitution by the light of history and philosophy, and with some prevision of its actual working, are confined to recent times and excite a special wonder. In particular, the democratic movement of modern times has been chiefly unconscious. As de Tocqueville says of its course in France, it has always advanced without guidance. The heads of the state have made no preparation for it, and it has advanced without their consent or without their knowledge. The most powerful, the most intelligent, and the most moral classes of the nation have never attempted to guide it. Will has been alive only in details, in the smaller courses of life, in what each man was doing for himself and his neighbors, while the larger structure and movement have been subconscious, and for that reason, erratic and wasteful. For it is just as true of large wholes as of individuals that if they blunder on without knowing what they are doing, much of their energy is lost. No doubt it is better to go ahead even blindly than to stand still. And remarkable things have been achieved in this way, but they are little to what might be done if we could work out our highest human nature intelligently, with assurance and prevision, and on a large scale. A society which did this would have the same sort of superiority to present society as man to his subhuman progenitors. The very idea of progress, of orderly improvement on a great scale, is well known to be of recent origin, or at least recent diffusion, the prevalent view in the past having been that the actual state of things was, in its general character, unalterable. Even at the present day, social phenomena of a large sort are for the most part not willed at all, but are the unforeseen result of diverse and partial endeavors. It is seldom that any large plan of social action is intelligently drawn up and followed out. Each interest works along in a somewhat blind and selfish manner, grasping, fighting, and groping. As regards general ends, most of the energy is wasted, and yet a sort of advance takes place, more like the surging of a throng than the orderly movement of troops. Who can pretend that the American people, for instance, are guided by any clear and rational plan in their economic, political, and religious development? They have glimpses and impulses, but hardly a will except on a few matters of near and urgent interest. In the same way, the wrongs that afflict society are seldom willed by any one or any group, but are byproducts of acts of will having other objects. They are done, as someone has said, rather with the elbows than the fists. There is surprisingly little ill intent, and the more one looks into life, the less he finds of that vivid chiaroscuro of conscious goodness and badness his childish teaching has led him to expect. Take, for instance, a conspicuous evil like the sweating system in the garment trades of New York or London. Here are people, largely women and children, forced to work 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, in the midst of dirt, bad air, and contagion, suffering the destruction of home life and decent nurture, and all for a wage hardly sufficient to buy the bare necessities of life. But if one looks for sin dark enough to cast such a shadow, he will scarcely find it. Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents. The sweater or immediate employer to whom he first turns is commonly himself a workman, not much raised above the rest and making but little profit on his transactions. Beyond him is the large dealer, usually a well-intentioned man, quite willing that things should be better if they can be made so without too much trouble or pecuniary loss to himself. He is only doing what others do and what, in his view, the conditions of trade require, and so on. The closer one gets to the facts, the more evident it is that nowhere is the indubitable wickedness our feelings have pictured. It is quite the same with political corruption and the venal alliance between wealth and party management. The men who control wealthy interests are probably no worse intentioned than the rest of us. They only do what they think they are forced to do in order to hold their own. And so with the politician, he finds that others are selling their power, and easily comes to think of it as a matter of course. In truth, the consciously, flagrantly wicked man is, and perhaps always has been, a fiction for the most part of denunciation. The psychologist will hardly find him, but will feel that most sorts of badness are easily enough comprehensible, and will perhaps agree with the view ascribed to Goethe, that he never heard of a crime which he might not himself have committed. Naturally, the more mechanical the system is, the less of will and of live human nature there is in its acts. So, in Russia, says Tolstoy, some make the laws, others execute them. Some train men by discipline to autocratic obedience. And these last, in their turn, become the instruments of coercion and slay their kind without knowing why or to what end. In our reading and thinking democracy, there is at least the feeling that the working of the whole ought to be the fulfillment of some humane purpose, and a continual protest that this is not more the case. I cannot hold out a prospect of the early appearance of an adequate public will. It is a matter of gradual improvement, but it seems clear that there is a trend this way based mechanically on recent advances in communication, and as regards training, on the multiform disciplines and voluntary cooperation which modern life affords. In the growth of public will, any agency amenable to public opinion may serve as an instrument, and this means, of course, any sort of rational activity, personal as well as institutional. Thus, the work of a secluded scientist, like Pasteur or Edison, taken together with the general acceptance and application of his results, is as much an act of public will as the proceedings of a legislature, and often more, because they may show a more public spirit and a wider knowledge and foresight. What is necessary is that somewhere there shall be effectual purpose and endeavor based on a large grasp of the situation. In short, public will is simply a matter of the more efficient organization of the general mind. Whatever in the way of leadership or mechanism contributes to the latter has a share in it, and we may naturally expect it to progress rather by the quickening and coordination of many agencies than by the aggrandizement of any particular one. The view which many hold that public will must be chiefly, if not wholly, identified with the institution of government is a just one only in a certain narrow sense. That is to say, the mechanism of government is indeed the most definite and authoritative expression of public choice, and if public will is to be limited to what is decided by a count of voices and carried out, if necessary, by force, then the government is its only agent. But only a small part of the will of society is of this sort. In a larger sense, it is a diversified whole, embracing the thought and purpose of all institutions and associations, formal and informal, that have any breadth of aim, and even, as I have said, of secluded individuals. Surely the true will of humanity never has been and is not likely to be concentrated in a single agent, but works itself out through many instruments, and the unity we need is something much more intricate and flexible than could be secured through the state alone. Like other phases of organization, government is merely one way of doing things, fitted by its character for doing some things and unfitted for doing others. As to what these things are, we must, of course, take the relative point of view and hold that the sphere of government operations is not, and should not be, fixed, but varies with the social condition at large. Hard and fast theories of what the state may best be and do, whether restrictive or expansive, we may well regard with distrust. It is by no means impossible that the whole character of the political state and of its relation to the rest of life is undergoing change of an unforeseeable kind, which will eventually make our present dogmas on this point quite obsolete. The most evident advantage of government as a social instrument, that which makes it the logical recourse of those who seek a short way to regeneration, is its power and reach. It is the strongest and most extensive of our institutions, with elaborate machinery ready to undertake almost anything and power limited, in the long run, only by public opinion. Moreover, under a democratic system, it is definitely responsible to the people. Not that it always serves them. We know too well how apt it is to respect particular rather than general interests, but there is always a definite means of bringing it into line with public thought, always reigns which the people may grasp if they will. This has the momentous effect that there is less jealousy of a democratic government, other things equal, than of any other form of power. Feeling that it is potentially at least their own, the people will endure from it with patience abuses that would be intolerable from any other source. The maddening thing about the oppression of private monopolies is the personal subjection, the humiliation of being unable to assert oneself. While in public life the free citizen has always a way of regular and dignified protest, he appeals not to an alien but to a larger self. The most general defect of government is that which goes with its good qualities. Just because it is the most ancient and elaborate machine we have, it is apt to be too mechanical, too rigid, too costly and unhuman. As the most institutional of institutions, it has a certain tendency toward formalism and is objectionable on grounds of red tape, lack of economy and remoteness from the fresher needs of the people. It is easy, however, for one impressed with this idea to be too indiscriminate in its application. Much depends upon the kind of government actually in question, upon the interest the people take in it, and many other conditions. In the United States, for instance, each of us lives under three somewhat distinct kinds of government: federal, state, and local, each of which has a large measure of practical independence of the others, and may be treated as a separate agent of public will. Moreover, it is often the case that the larger systems, say the federal post office, allow a great deal of local autonomy in their administration, making it flexible to local opinion. Under this system, a township, village, or small city is no unwieldy machine, but pretty much what the people see fit to make it, and the fact that it is a phase of government is no sufficient reason why any affairs it may choose to undertake may not be as humanly and flexibly administered as those of a non-political association of equal extent. They often are so administered, and the same is true of great cities wherever a vigorous civic consciousness exists and has had time to work out its instruments. The question is only one of organization, and this confronts non-political associations as well as political. Large private incorporations having notoriously about the same experience of formalism, extravagance, and malfeasance as the state. There are certain characteristics whose presence in a given function is favorable to state activity, though they cannot be said to indicate clearly where it should begin or end. One of these, naturally, is the inadequacy or harmfulness of other agencies. The fact that a work is deemed necessary and that there is no other adequate way of doing it is the real basis of most state functions. Not only the primary ones of waging war and keeping order, but of issuing money, building roads, bridges, and harbors, collecting statistics, instituting free schools, controlling monopolies, and so on. Another is that the work in question should be susceptible of comparatively simple and uniform methods. Since the more various and intricate a function is, the more difficulty will be found in getting it properly done by the powerful, but usually somewhat clumsy mechanism of the state. The reasons that may justify a state post or telegraph, for instance, do not necessarily suffice for the assumption of the far more complicated business of the railways. Again, whatever the state undertakes should be something likely to be watched by public opinion, not necessarily by the whole public, but at least by some powerful group steadfastly interested in efficiency and capable of judging whether it is attained. In the United States, certainly, the successes or failures of government are largely explicable on this ground. Public education works well, in spite of a constant leaning toward formalism, because the people take a close and jealous interest in it, while the monetary and financial functions are in like manner safeguarded by the scrutiny of the commercial world. But in the matter of tariffs, the scrutiny of the latter, inadequately balanced by that of any other interest, has produced what is practically class legislation. And something similar may be said of many phases of government action. From such considerations, it seems that local government, because it is on a small scale and because the people will presumably be more able and willing to watch the details of its operation, should be the sphere in which extension of functions has the most chance of success. The more the citizen feels that government is close to him and amenable to his will, the more, other things equal, he should be inclined to trust it and to put himself into it. In spite of much disappointing experience, it seems reasonable to expect that small units, dealing with the everyday interests of the people, will, in the long run, enlist an ample share of their capacity and integrity. And yet the nearness of the whole to the will of the member is psychical, not spatial, so that if the citizen for some reason feels closer to the central government, and trusts it more, he may be more willing to aggrandize it. In the United States, the people often have more interest and confidence in the federal system than in their particular states and cities. One reason being that the constant enlargement of private organization, as in the case of railways and the so-called trusts, puts it beyond the power of local control. Of course, there is a natural sphere of development for each of the various phases of government. Municipal socialism has the great advantage over other sorts of state extension of being optional by small units, and of permitting all sorts of diversity, experiment, and comparison. There is nothing in it of that deadening uniformity and obliteration of alternatives involved in the blanket socialism of the central state. The evils we suffer from private monopolies, against which we may always invoke the state if not other competitors, are as nothing compared with those to be feared from an all-embracing state monopoly, and I feel sure that common sense, a shrewd attachment to the principle of checks and balances, and the spirit of local individuality will preserve the English-speaking nations, at least from a serious danger of the latter. In countries like France, where there is a great traditional preponderance of the central authority, it may be among the possibilities, though the probable decline of war, the main cause of mechanical consolidation, should work in the opposite direction. There are few things that would be more salutary to the life of our people than a lively and effective civic consciousness in towns, villages, and rural communities. I trust this is growing and feel no dread of any socialism which it may prove to involve. One of the best things I have known Ann Arbor to do was to hold a public school carnival on the occasion of the opening of a new high school. There were all sorts of performances by the children, largely of their own devising, and the people were interested and brought together as never, perhaps, before. It was communal, it was ours, and the social spirit it evoked was a common joy. Enterprises of the same nature on a larger and more permanent scale, such as the recreation centers of Chicago, are beginning to arise in various parts of the country. It seems probable that the plain citizen must look largely to the communal life to supply that chance for self-expression, which town residents and the specialized nature of modern industry have so largely restricted. Urban life is inevitable, and instead of regretting the country, the city dwellers had better make the most of the new situation, through playgrounds, public amusements, socialized schools, recreation centers, and in general, a more vital and human civic organization. The fundamental need of men is for self-expression, for making their will felt in whatever they feel to be close to their hearts, and they will use the state in so far and in such a manner as they find it helpful in gratifying this need. The more self-expression, therefore, there is in other spheres of life, the less need. Relatively, people will feel of acting through government, a principle which should remind those who dread the growth of the latter that the only sure way to restrict it is by developing a real, affirmative freedom in other relations. Political democracy plus social and economic oppression is pretty sure to equal state socialism, because men will look to political control as a refuge. But if general conditions are free and open, men will be the more sensible, by contrast, of the unfree aspects of state activity. A lack of economy in government will not much check its aggrandizement if the need of it is strongly felt on other grounds, since human nature, on the whole, cares very little for economy in comparison with freedom and justice. One will more willingly pay a water tax of $20 to a city government, in which he has a voice, than of 10 to an alien and overbearing corporation. In our day, there is a tendency toward extension of state functions, which after all is perhaps no more than symmetrical in view of the general expansion of larger structures in every sphere. It does not seem to outstrip the growth, for instance, of private corporations or labor unions, or of individual wealth. It is easy to see a tendency to state socialism if you look only at the new functions of the state. Easy to see an opposite tendency if you fix your attention on private organization. Whether or not the state is relatively increasing its sphere is not easy to decide. The new conditions of life bring men closer together, creating a general need of wider organization. And, so far as now appears, this need is to be met by the simultaneous development of various structures already well begun, such as popular government and education, private industrial and commercial corporations, labor unions, mutual aid societies, philanthropical associations, and so on. The special demand for state extension seems to spring chiefly from two conditions: the need to control the exorbitant power of private economic associations, and the need of meeting novel problems arising from life in great cities. In these and similar directions, an intelligent and practiced democracy will proceed tentatively, with the firm foot below, always balancing the loss against the gain. Experiments in political socialism are sure to be tried, which will prove instructive and perhaps beneficial. How far they will be carried, no man can say, but I see no special reason to fear that they will go to any pernicious extreme. The main source of a more effective public will is to be sought not peculiarly in the greater activity of government, but in the growing efficiency of the intellectual and moral processes as a whole. This general striving of the public mind toward clearer consciousness is too evident to escape any observer. In every province of life, a multiform social knowledge is arising, and, mingling with the higher impulses of human nature, is forming a system of rational ideals, which through leadership and emulation gradually work their way into practice. Compare, for instance, the place now taken in our universities by history, economics, political science, sociology, and the like with the attention given them, say, in 1875, when in fact some of these studies had no place at all. Or consider the multiplication since the same date of government bureaus, federal, state, and local, whose main function is to collect, arrange, and disseminate social knowledge. It is not too much to say that governments are becoming more and more vast laboratories of social science. Observe also the number of books and periodicals seriously devoted to these subjects. No doubt much of this work is feverish and shallow, as must be expected in a time of change. But there is, on the whole, nothing more certain or more hopeful than the advance in the larger self-knowledge of mankind. One result of this clearer consciousness is that idealism is coming to be organic. That is to say, each particular ideal is coming to be formed and pursued in subordination to a system of ideals based on a large perception of fact. While putting a special enthusiasm into his own work, the idealist is learning that he needs to have also a general understanding of every good work and of the whole to which all contribute. For him to imagine that his is the only work worth doing is as unfortunate as for the captain of a company to imagine that he is conducting the whole campaign. Other things equal, the most effective idealists are those who are most sane and who have a sense for the complication, interdependence, and inertia of human conditions. A study of the ideals and programs that have had most acceptance even in recent years would make it apparent that our state of mind regarding society has been much like that which prevailed regarding the natural world when men sought the philosopher's stone and the fountain of perpetual youth. Much energy has been wasted, or nearly wasted, in the exclusive and intolerant advocacy of special schemes, single tax, prohibition, state socialism, and the like, each of which was imagined by its adherents to be the key to millennial conditions. Every year, however, makes converts to the truth that no isolated scheme can be a good scheme, and that real progress must be an advance all along the line. Those who see only one thing can never see that truly, and so must work, even at that, in a somewhat superficial and erratic manner. For similar reasons, our moral schemes and standards must grow larger and more commensurate with the life which they aim to regulate. The higher will can never work out unless it is as intelligently conceived and organized as commerce and politics. Evidently, if we do not see how life really goes and what good and ill are under actual conditions, we can neither inculcate nor follow the better courses. There is nothing for it but to learn to feel and to effectuate kinds of right involving a sense of wider and remoter results than men have been used to take into account. As fast as science enables us to trace the outcome of a given sort of action, we must go on to create a corresponding sense of responsibility for that outcome. The popular systems of ethics are wholly inadequate, and all thinking persons are coming to see that those traits of decency and the obvious relations of life that we have been accustomed to regard as morality are in great part of secondary importance. Many of them are of somewhat the same character as John Woolman's refusal to wear dyed hats. We wonder that people do not see something more important to exercise their consciences upon. When the larger movements of life were subconscious and the good and ill flowing from them were ascribed to an inscrutable providence, morality could not be concerned with them. But the more we understand them, the more they must appear the chief field for its activity. We still have to do with obvious wrong, the drunkard, the housebreaker, the murderer, and the like. But these simple offenses are easy to deal with comparatively, as being evident and indubitable, so that all normal people condemn them. No great ability or organization upholds them. They are like the outbreaks of savages or children in that they do not constitute a formidable menace to society. And, moreover, we are coming to see that they are most effectually dealt with by indirect and preventive methods. The more dangerous immorality is, of course, that which makes use of the latest engines of politics or commerce to injure the community. Wrongdoers of this kind are usually decent and kindly in daily walk and conversation, as well as supporters of the church and other respectable institutions. For the most part, they are not even hypocrites, but men of a dead and conventional virtue, not awake to the real meaning of what they are and do. A larger morality requires that they should be waked up, that a public conscience based on knowledge should judge things by their true results, and should know how to make its judgments effectual. Moreover, this is not a matter merely of the bad men whom we read about in the newspapers, but one of personal guilt in all of us. It is my observation that the same wrongs which are held up to execration in the magazines are present, under appropriate forms, among teachers, lawyers, ministers, reputable tradesmen, and others who come under my immediate notice. We are all in it. The narrow principles are much the same, the differences being largely in the scale of operations, in being or not being found out, in more or less timidity and taking risks and so on. A somewhat similar problem is that of energizing indirect service. The groups we serve, the nation, the educational institution, the oppressed class, for instance, have come to be so vast and often so remote from the eye that even the ingenuity of the newspaper and magazine press can hardly make them alive for us and draw our hearts and our money in their direction. The we does not live in face-to-face contact, and though photo engravings and stereopticons and exhibitions and vivid writing are a marvelous substitute, they are often inadequate, so that we do not feel the cogency of the common interest so immediately as did the men of the clans. Civilization, says Professor Simon Patton, spares us more and more the sight of anguish, and our imaginations must be correspondingly sharpened to see in the checkbook an agent as spiritual and poetic as the grime and bloodstain of ministering hands. How far this may come to pass it is hard to say. For myself, I do not find it easy to write checks for objects that are not made real to me by some sort of personal contact. No doubt, however, our growing system of voluntary institutions, churches, philanthropic societies, fraternal orders, labor unions, and the like, are training us in the habit of expressing ourselves through the checkbook and other indirect agents. I expect, however, that the best results will flow not merely from an intelligent, general benevolence that writes checks for all sorts of good causes, but from a kind of specialization in well-doing that will enable one by familiarity to see through the tangle of relations at a particular point and act in the view of truth. In philanthropy, for instance, an increasing number of men and women of wealth and ability will devote not only their checks, but trained thought and personal exertion to some particular sort of work, which takes hold of their interest, to the welfare of dependent children, of the blind, and so on, making this their business, giving it the same close and eager attention they would any other business, and so coming to understand it through and through. These, along with salaried workers, will be the leaders in each special line and will draw after them the less personal support of those who have confidence in them. But people will never send much of their treasure where their heart does not go first. Every city and neighborhood has its urgent social needs which the resident may study and devote himself to with much better results to the world and to his own character than if he limits himself to the writing of checks. And for that matter, every occupation, as law, medicine, teaching, and the various sorts of business and hand labor, has its own philanthropies and reforms into which one may put all the devotion he is capable of. If each of us chooses some disinterested form of public service and puts himself thoroughly into it, things will go very well. Another tendency involved in the rise of public will is that toward a greater simplicity and flexibility of structure in every province of life. Principles are taking the place of formulas. In the early history of a science, the body of knowledge consists of a mass of ill-understood and ill-related observations, speculations, and fancies, which the disciple takes on the authority of the master. But as principles are discovered, this incoherent structure falls to pieces and is replaced by a course of study based on experiment and inference. So, in the early growth of every institution, the truth that it embodies is not perceived or expressed in simplicity, but obscurely incarnated in custom and formula. The perception of principles does not do away with the mechanism, but tends to make it simple, flexible, human, definitely serving a conscious purpose, and quick to stand or fall according to its success. Under the old system, everything is preserved because men do not know just where the virtue resides. Under the new, the essential is kept and the rest thrown away. Or we may say that the change is like the substitution of an alphabet for picture writing, with the result that language becomes at the same time more complex in its structure and simpler in its elements, when once it is discovered that all speech may be reduced to a few elementary sounds. The symbols of these, being sufficient to express all possible words, are more efficient and less cumbersome than the many characters that were used before. The method of this change is that struggle for existence among ideas, which is implied in the wide and free intercourse of modern life. In this, only the vital, human, and indispensable can survive, and truth is ever casting off superfluity and working itself down to first principles. We have remarked this in the case of religion, and it would be easy to find the same process at work in other traditions. The modern world, then, in spite of its complexity, may become fundamentally simpler, more consistent and reasonable. Apparently, formalism can never more be an accepted and justified condition, any more than reason can be exchanged for the blind instinct of the lower animals. It will exist wherever thought and feeling are inadequate to create a will, as is much the case at present, but people will not be content with it as in the past. There will be creeds, but they will affirm no more than is really helpful to believe. Ritual, but only what is beautiful or edifying. Everything must justify itself by function. Public will, like individual will, has the purpose of effecting an adaptation to conditions that is rational and economical instead of haphazard and wasteful. In general, it should greatly diminish, though it can hardly obviate, the cost of social change. In commerce, for instance, it has already rendered crises less sudden and destructive, in spite of the enormous scale of modern transactions, and the time should not be very far away when trouble of this sort will be so foreseen and discounted and so provided against by various sorts of insurance as to do but little damage. In the same way, the vast problem of poverty and of the degeneracy that springs from it can be met and in great part conquered by a long-sighted philanthropy and education. In religion, there is apparently no more need of that calamitous overthrow of the foundations of belief from which many suffered in the passing generation. In the state, violent revolution seems likely to disappear as fast as democracy is organized, while in international relations it will be strange if we do not see a rapid diminution of war. In all these matters, and in many others, social costs are capable of being foreseen and provided against by rational measures expressing an enlightened public will. The guiding force back of public will, now as ever, is of course human nature itself in its more enduring characteristics, those which find expression in primary groups and are little affected by institutional changes. This nature, familiar yet inscrutable, is apparently in a position to work itself out more adequately than at any time in the past. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.